It's great to welcome to the program today Barry Meier, who is the former Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times reporter and author of the book Spooked: The Secret Rise of Private Spies. Barry, it's so great to have you on today.
Thanks, David. Thanks so much for inviting me on.
So, to start with, when we talk about private spies, we're not talking about a private investigator because you suspect your spouse might be cheating on you. We're really talking here about high level intelligence work that often relates to foreign policy, domestic policy, etc. Give us like an overview of this industry and kind of how it developed.
Sure. It really got its start back in the late 1970s with a gentleman by the name of Jules Kroll, who created a company called Kroll Associates. And at that time, the public image of the private investigator was, as you mentioned, the guy in a raincoat who like hangs around motels trying to catch cheating spouses. Kroll realized that there was a huge marketplace for investigative services, particularly from corporations, because this was a period of time where there were a lot of corporate takeovers and shareholder battles. So he formed what was essentially the investigative equivalent of a law firm. These guys dressed well, they looked good. He hired not only ex-FBI agents and former prosecutors, but really smart college graduates who were interested in investigations. And thus began this industry that describes itself as, corporate investigators or corporate intelligence. But basically, they are skilled investigators who are hired by law firms, Hollywood moguls, political parties, you name it, to go out and dig up information and often dirt on their clients' adversaries.
And this can include, I mean, I'm reading Lawrence Wright's Going Clear right now. The Church of Scientology employs individuals like this regularly. We could talk about the so-called Trump dossier and whether that would fit the bill as the type of product that would kind of be produced by this. What are some of the maybe less obvious functions of such private spies?
Yeah, so it could be anything from, what we think of as legitimate use of investigators, finding missing people. It could be digging up material for lawsuits, locating witnesses for lawsuits. But the range is huge. As you mentioned, groups like Scientology, which are under public scrutiny, will hire investigators to dig up information or even try to intimidate their adversaries or critics. I mean, when I was first working for the time, back when I was working for the Times investigating Purdue Pharma, they hired Kroll to investigate people who were suing the company and also looked at me not long ago when Patrick Radin Keith was writing his book about the Sacklers. He found investigators sitting outside his house. Then you had cases where Hollywood has, made use of private investigators all the time to intimidate people. There was a famous case of Anthony Pellicano, who
Yep.
broke into the car of a Los Angeles Times reporter who was looking into him. So, I mean, the gamut is huge. What kind of unites this industry, I would say, is the willingness of these individuals, these investigators, private spies, whatever you want to call them, to use any means necessary to gather information about their targets.
So that gets me to maybe when we'll talk about in a moment maybe some ways in which there's sort of a upside here to private spies, but it seems one of the concerns would be there might be things corporations want done or governments want done or whoever that they would be worried about being caught doing, and the private investigator provides at least plausible deniability. Is that in fact the case? Is that what's attractive?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Basically, it's private investigators have been described as the gloves that lawyers put on when they don't want to get their hands dirty. And so that's the concept here. I mean, they will undertake uh, things that, lawyers will claim they never ordered and are shocked to learn when it comes out they in fact signed off on it. Perfect example being David Boies's firm. As you know, David Boies is probably one of the best known lawyers
Yep.
in the United States. He's most famous for the Gore Bush recount, working for the Democratic Party in that case, also for bringing the litigation in the Supreme Court that led to the upholding of same-sex marriage. A good guy in the eyes of most people. In fact, his law firm signed off on a contract that called for this, uh, this Israeli private spying firm, Black Cube, who uses kind of very despicable types of tactics to, one, uh, spy on women who were bringing claims of sexual assault against Harvey Weinstein, and also spy on reporters for the New Yorker and the New York Times who were investigating Harvey Weinstein's sexual assault allegations.
Yeah, if people are interested in that, Ronan Farrow's recent book, the title of the book escapes me, but it's by Ronan Farrow and it's about the Harvey Weinstein story. outlines
Exactly.
that quite a bit.
Yes, it's called Catch and Kill.
Catch and Kill. Yes, exactly. Now, to sort of, I don't even know if this is playing devil's advocate, but to sort of see it from the other side, there are definitely circumstances we could imagine where the power of a government, the American government, for example, could be brought down against someone for political reasons or for reasons that you, me, or anybody might say are not on the up and up. Is there a case to be made that the ability to hire a so-called private spy to try to match, at least in some small way, the government's ability to bring political charges and use their investigative power against an individual or a corporation could be a good thing? I mean, I'm thinking out loud here.
Yes, I mean, let me give you a perfect example because there's a lawsuit playing out right now. And the parties to the lawsuit, neither of them are particularly attractive. They're not good guys in common parlance. But through a just a bizarre set of circumstances, the defendant in the case became aware that his emails had been hacked, and that his emails had been hacked and dumped on the internet on this sort of obscure law website where lawyers for his adversary suddenly discovered them and then used them in litigation against him.
Right.
Well, after this case was decided, it was subsequently uncovered by a group of internet activists what the likely source of the hacked material was, who had done the hacking. And this individual then went out and retained his own private investigator to dig into this, and is now constructing a case to expose the hacking that went on against him. And so, there are many situations where the use of a private investigator, private spy, to defend yourself, to go and uncover wrongdoing that has been taken place against you, be it by a government or by an individual actor, private actor, is more than justified.
If we want to think about the way that journalists, as well as the media and consumers of media, should think about information that comes from private spies. I mean, there's sort of protocol for how do you handle a politician when you're talking to them for a story you might be writing? How do you deal with an anonymous source? How do you deal with a sort of civilian, non-public person in order to provide them certain protections? In terms of both the individuals and the information that comes from them, how should journalists, reporters, and interviewers be thinking about what comes from private spies?
Well, I think this is a real motivation for me when I wrote the book. And there was a certain epiphany for me when I wrote the book, because I deal a lot with the Steele dossier, the opposition research that was done against Donald Steele by this private investigative firm that hired an ex MI6 agent,
Against
Christopher
Donald Trump,
Steele.
just to be clear, just so the audience, you met
Yes.
you said Donald Steele, you met Donald Trump, I
Oh,
assume. Yeah,
Donald Trump, right. And
yeah,
Christopher Steele, this
yeah.
ex MI6 agent, was hired to basically gather dirt on Donald Trump in Russia. Now, when this was being shopped to media organizations, it was implicit when it was being shown around by an investigative firm in D.C. that was in fact formed by two former Wall Street Journal reporters, that they couldn't identify the involvement of this firm, Fusion GPS, or Christopher Steele in the gathering of this information. It had to come from, sort of, appear out of the blue. It was like, immaculate conception. And when BuzzFeed published this information on the web, and it was embraced by particularly, opponents of Donald Trump, and sort of became the focus of political and cultural and media conversation for 3 years, it didn't come out until late in the game that, in fact, this was a product of these private operatives
Right.
who had put it together, and no one even knew what sources they were drawing upon. And so, the lesson I try to draw in the book, and the sort of issue that comes out in the book, is that, we as journalists, and I consider myself one, um, is that we really have to be more transparent with our audience, with our readers, our viewers, our listeners, about where this information is coming from. Why should we give people who are paid to gather what's effectively dirt and use our stories, our articles, our broadcasts as the means to disseminate that information to the public? Why should we treat them like whistleblowers? Why should we give them complete
Mm.
anonymity? Because it's not fair to the public. The public is being misled. And, this dance has gone on, this symbiotic relationship that has gone on between journalists and private spies for decades. But if there is one lesson we should take away from the whole, Steele Trump dossier incident, is that we really do need to be more transparent.
They need to be identified as sources, whereas the FBI might be a source for something about an investigation. We would identify where
And it's
the
like coming from a
provenance.
government source,
Yeah.
or, you need to, when people have a vested interest in getting out information, you don't have to say it's coming from Fusion GPS. You don't have to say, per se, it's coming from Christopher Steele, but you damn well sure saying that it was put together by individuals who had an axe to grind, or who were being paid to plant this information.
This was a
And then,
paid research project by
yes,
opponents of Donald Trump.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. By the Democratic National Committee. And the money was like laundered through lawyers for the Democratic National Committee. And once journalists became aware that Fusion GPS and Christopher Steele were involved in it, then they had a duty to go a step further and to scrutinize those people,
Right.
to scrutinize that firm, to scrutinize Christopher Steele, and say, what do we know about these people? Who have their clients been in the past? And how does that influence our assessment or analysis of how accurate the claims in the dossier are?
In the very limited time we have left, is your sense that the dossier is sort of a mixed bag, in the sense that, I'll just leave it there. Like, for example, I spoke to Michael Cohen last week, and he said the thing about him going to Prague, he's really never been to Prague. It wasn't like, well, he was in the airport, but he didn't clear customs. And so technically it was like, he doesn't know where that came from. But there were other things in there that either by coincidence or because they were better researched were true.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the Russian government tried to influence the 2016 election. There is no doubt that Donald Trump and his allies, his son, embraced efforts by Russia to influence the election. I mean, Russia, are you listening? Right? I
Right.
mean, wasn't that his big campaign rap? So, yeah, I mean, there was that. Russia was trying to influence. But that wasn't you. That finding or that assertion was not unique to the Steele dossier. It wasn't. He was not the only person that became aware of that. What is troubling is that the specific allegations in the Steele dossier, one, that Michael Cohen went to Prague, when in fact, if Michael Cohen had lied, Michael Cohen lied about a lot of things, and he got rung up for lying.
Yeah.
And he would have gotten rung up for lying about that, and he didn't. So he wasn't in Prague for that meeting. That Carter Page, another Trump ally, was offered like this huge stake in a Russian energy company. No evidence that that occurred. And the most infamous of all, P-tape, which has yet to emerge. So there's a lot in the dossier which either has not proven to be true or been proven not to be true.
We've been speaking with Barry Meier, author of the book Spooked: The Secret Rise of Private Spies. Barry, such a pleasure having you on. I really appreciate your time.
And thank you, David. I really appreciate your having me on today.